Hello, BookTube. It's November, and that is ordinarily a time for two massive events that usually run on parallel tracks. On BookTube, that is the time for Nonfiction November from Olive at a Book Olive, one of the greatest BookTube events of them all, where we are urged, you are urged, we are all urged to read more nonfiction. Add some of it to your reading if you read none. Add a little more of it if you read some. Uh, Maybe make videos about it if you have a video, if you have a BookTube channel. I, of course, love Nonfiction November. It was one of the first things I noticed about BookTube because I'm a lifelong reader of nonfiction and have been advocating the reading of nonfiction for a long, long time. So it seemed like a natural fit. And the other event that usually runs on parallel tracks with Nonfiction November is still, has in many ways been adopted over the years as a BookTube event, and that is not NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, where every year in November, hundreds of thousands of people all over the world are encouraged to write the first draft of a novel, 50,000 words. A self-evidently insane goal that was made all the more fun by how insane it was. That's 1,667 words a day in a month that for most people, students, workers, whatever, is really busy. You're still supposed to do it. You're still supposed to make the time. And the NaNoWriMo discussion boards, the discussion forums, filled with stories of people doing that and bonding with each other over that. People in Switzerland and Somalia sharing stories with each other about how hard it is to carve out time to make those words, how important it is to prepare in October, for instance. Whether or not you're going to be a planner who's plotted out every last detail and just has to write it, or you're going to be a pantser who's not making up anything ahead of time and is going to fly by the seat of their pants, or if you're going to be somewhere in between. That was the main draw for me for NaNoWriMo, was not the discipline of writing. I'm okay on the discipline front, but the community of it. That all these people were doing this together, that they were all coming up with ideas, trying to pick the idea that had the most legs, getting themselves through that heartbreaking second week when even a good idea feels like a death sentence. So I was a little bit in mourning, as so many other people were, when NaNoWriMo came out with a statement recently on the subject of so-called generative AI. A natural question, a natural subject for them to come out with a statement on. Surely NaNoWriMo, the powers that be at NaNoWriMo, are against and are ruling out the possibility that you could just make an AI write your story. No more second week Heartbreak Hill. No more stories to share with each other. No, the story you'll share now will be what software you use to write your story. Naturally, NaNoWriMo is going to put out a statement about generative AI and say, we're against it. Don't use it. And of course, you're not qualified if you use it. You disqualify yourself if you're not writing your own story. And they didn't do that. Instead, they came out with a statement saying not only that they were all in favor of generative AI, a fact that I'm sure wasn't at all connected to their new sponsor being an AI creator, but also that if you weren't in favor of a machine writing your stories for you, you were a bigot. Their response to this subject of generative AI was to go all the way back to 2019 and come up with an answer from then and use it now. So not only invalidating their own mission, but attacking their own supporters at the same time. A lot of people left NaNoWriMo as soon as they read that statement, and I myself did as well. Made a video about it. I still believe, I don't know, I'm just a cockeyed optimist. I still believe that NaNoWriMo could trade on the enormous amount of goodwill that they have amassed over the decade and fix that problem. But they have not. Because another element of the 21st century, in addition to calling anyone who disagrees with you a bigot, another element of the 21st century is that you never, ever apologize for anything, under any circumstances whatsoever, for any conceivable reason. Not even, and especially not, if you are self-evidently wrong. Never, ever do that. Apparently, they've imbibed 2020 totally, because they are not going to do that. So although Nonfiction November is going strong, there is that void for NaNoWriMo. I didn't think I would feel it as strong as I have. I will write an essay about it. I am getting back into the habit of exercising all sorts of feelings by writing essays about them, for Steve Reads, my revived literary blog that is a catch-all for all the kinds of writing and bookish things that I want to write about, have no venue otherwise to write about. I have a feeling I made the decision to revive. I didn't make the decision, but David Murphy made the decision to revive my literary blog in the middle of this year. And it's a fairly big decision, a new venue, a new writing project. I ordinarily wouldn't make such a project except in the wake of a new year. But I did anyway because it seemed right and it seemed very attractive. I think, though, that I'm really going to embrace it in the new year. But anyway, in response to that combination, that odd offset combination, I made the proposition the other day on this channel that you should try your hand not just at reading nonfiction in Nonfiction November, but at writing nonfiction in Nonfiction November. Specifically, that you should pick some small local subject and write its history. Get your writing bug out of your system that way, by wholeheartedly participating in Nonfiction November. The Nonfiction November's rungs have always been read some if you read none, read more if you read some, and the final rung for real fanatics, read only nonfiction in the month of November. And I discovered an extra rung, which is write nonfiction in Nonfiction November. Pick something small, some local subject. Your local rec center, or your VA administration building, or your pet shelter, or your library, and research that and write its history. I got a lot of comments about that video. I'm still getting comments about that video. People who've been saying to me that it amazed them. They never really thought about it before. In that video, I adamantly say that you do not need some sort of mystical training. You do not need to be part of some sort of mystical society in order to write history. You just have to do the things that historians do. I've gotten a lot of emails from people saying, I'd never really thought of that. It sounds like a lot of fun. It sounds in a way like more fun, and certainly a different kind of fun, than trying to write a novel. I agree. I agree completely. But in that idea of mine, how about we respond to the negative of not having NaNoWriMo by writing nonfiction in Nonfiction November? That was my attempt to turn a negative into a positive, which I try to do. Believe it or not, I try to do that all the time. If something negative happens, I immediately try to think, what is something positive that is either part of this negative thing or can be extracted from it? And likewise, this video today, where I want to try to extract a positive from a negative. Because among many, many good emails that I got about that video that I made, I got one bad one. Only one. That's a good thing right there. I got one bad one. I got an email from somebody saying, thank heavens that I've got it right here for my grievance book, my great book of grievances. Bean, you can't just sit there like the raven do you want to go over to your chair? Oh, what are you doing? Oh, goodness. Do you want to go over to your chair, or do you want to come next to me? Oh, goodness gracious. Oh, stretch those glutes. Oh, goodness. Oh. Are you going to go over there? You are. Okay. All right. There you go. Where was I before my baby interrupted me? I spent such a beautiful morning just baking. The sun hit the fainting couch and we were just baking in it together with our faces smooshed together. Oh, right. The obnoxious letter. I got an obnoxious email from someone saying, interesting video. They always start that way, with a little pat on the head for little Timmy. I just managed to blindly back my way into an interesting video. And I got my congratulations for it. I'm really happy about that. Interesting video, but I'm really glad that you encourage people to write little local histories. How about we leave writing real history to professionals? And in such a situation, when my anger is threatening to get the best of me, I always try to wait and count to 10, control myself. I did that. And then I cussed this person out in enormous length. I told them that since an apology is not on the table in the 21st century. I basically don't want to hear from them again. We are on different paths in life, I think was the phrase that I chose. Because, of course, that is a snob's view of things. That is an elitist view of things. And that got me thinking that the way to turn that negative into a positive is to enhance my original call. I originally said, for NaNoWriMo and for Nonfiction November, maybe you ought to write nonfiction. Find something in your community, something you like, something that interests you. Research it. And by that, I mean, don't just ask somebody how it happened. I mean, document how it happened. Where would you find the documents? How would you parse which documents are valuable and which ones aren't? Which ones are reliable and which ones aren't? And come up with a history of that thing. And I think that's a good project. I think you should do that. But what if you wanted to do more than that? What if, in addition to having a little bit broader canvas fun, you wanted to stick a thumb in the eye of snobs like the one who wrote me that email? What if you wanted to research and write a bit of history for Nonfiction November? Not local history, but actual history. What if you wanted to do that? I want to talk about that a little in this video. I want to show you that the methods and the goals would not be any different. I know that for a lot of you emailed me, said, well, I never thought about this before, but surely I am not qualified to write a history of my local Elks Club. Surely I am not qualified to do that. Where's the qualification? Where is this magic qualification? I don't even get a degree in history, but that doesn't make you good at it. Where is this magic qualification? The qualification is how good a job you do at the two parts. Not just the one part that all of you were obsessing on in your emails to me, but both parts. The research and the writing. You're all leaving out the writing. That's a bad idea. But we'll get to that. A lot of you were a little bit doubtful in your emails, saying, well, I'm not qualified to do that. How could I research this? I was very thankful to see that no one immediately went to the worst place in the world for this kind of nonfiction writing, which is family genealogies. It's the worst place in the world to go for it, and it's also by far the most popular place to go. I was very glad that no one has thought of that. That's why I didn't propose it. We don't need any more navel gazing in the world. There's plenty of it already. I proposed find something in your community. Maybe you have like I do, maybe you have a lovely 19th century cemetery. Is there a local historical society that can help you with the primary documents of the history of that place? Who built it? And how much did they pay? And did it go through the city? And if so, when? And when a well-meaning local historian says, oh, you should check out so-and-so's book on that subject, say, no, I will check out so-and-so's book, but I want to research this subject myself. I don't want to take so-and-so's word for anything. I want to look at the documents themselves. One of the reasons that I suggested that kind of a project is because although I say it doesn't make a difference, the tools and the techniques for writing any kind of history, local, regional, national, are going to be the same. There is going to be a difference. Unfortunately, it's a negative difference, but there is going to be a difference, which is that the more you scale up what you're researching to write about, the more it's possible that you will encounter people and institutions who will demand that you do have some sort of credential, some sort of, are you a serious researcher? And if you are one, then I'm going to need some sort of verification of that fact, other than you just telling me that you are. I hate that, but that is necessary. That is nevertheless true. You will encounter that the more you scale up your project. But that's another subject. That's actually a subject for another video. There are ways around that usually, but for now, let's just talk about the projects themselves. What if you wanted to aim a little higher than a history of your local library? So let's step from the stage of local history, what is often condescendingly called local history, to history, just history with a capital H. In history with a capital H, there is still small history and large history. What the small history is usually under the heading of what I call on this channel keyhole histories, where somebody's looking at one very specific little thing. I'm going to research the heck out of that thing and then tell its story, and probably try to associate it, embed it in a broader web of significance. Okay, so that's little history, and then there's big history. What if you wanted to expand our project from Nonfiction November to those two things? So that's the big leagues. That's when, if you actually manage to do that, do the research, and then do the writing, and finish a manuscript, you could legitimately call yourself an amateur historian. There is no pejorative in that. I know it's often used as a pejorative, but there is no pejorative in that, provided your methods and your practice are scrupulous. If you make amateur mistakes, then the pejorative of amateur starts to apply. But if you don't, then you're just an amateur historian. And you don't need to stay amateur forever, right? If you do a really good job, I guarantee you could find an agent to represent your work to a publishing house. It might not be a very big publishing house, but then again, it might be. So let's take two subjects from history with a capital H and scale up the same kinds of writing history practices that I talked about in that last video, just to show you that it can be done. In both cases, I will choose a subject from capital H history that has never had a book. You'd think they've all been written on capital H history. Most certainly have not been. Because most people who study history as a profession have absolutely zero sense of what has any kind of commercial viability. And most people who have any sense of commercial viability have no sense of history. So I could literally package a history writing project that has commercial viability. Not that that's your end goal, but that has commercial viability. I could literally package one such thing every hour of every day for the rest of time. That's how many history books have not yet been written. So let's start with small. Let's start with a keyhole history, something small. I guess you could call both of these keyhole, but one of them is bigger than the other. Let's talk about 1812. A lot of things happened in the year 1812, of course, but one thing that happened in 1812 is that Lord Byron, once popular, once read, once revered as an English poet, a great English poet, made his maiden speech in the House of Lords. What if you wanted to write a book on that speech? What if you did? What if you wanted to write a book on that speech? No book has ever been written on it, so what if you wanted to write the first? What would you do? What would you have to do that? It's the same set of questions as in the first video. It's the same set of questions with your local animal shelter, only scaled up. What's the very first thing you would need to know if you were going to write a book about Lord Byron's maiden speech? You'd need to know the speech. Is there actually a record of it? Not people sitting in the audience taking notes on it, but the actual manuscript of it. So that you know what Lord Byron planned on saying. Well, that's the first place you'd want to start. And it turns out that the whole text of that speech was printed after Lord Byron died. Very shortly after Lord Byron died, those papers were made public in the possession of a man named Dallas, Robert Dallas. And he described his text of Byron's maiden speech as being from a cache of documents given to him by Byron himself. Is that true? You can find the text of the maiden speech online. That's easy to do. And that will be at least the first kernel of what you're going to do with this subject matter. But right away, you have to start asking questions, because if you're going to be any kind of historian, amateur or professional, your primary occupation is going to be to doubt. You must be a doubter. So the very first thing you have to ask is did this come to this author from Byron? You're going to have to determine that to the best of your ability. So you're probably going to have to try and get a hold of Dallas's collection of the correspondence and writings of Lord Byron from 1842 or something like that. Now, a book like that is not going to have been reprinted ever. But probably it's been transcribed online somewhere. You've got to keep in mind, you have the internet at your fingertips, and used correctly and candidly, it's the greatest research tool in the history of the world. And most of the people who've written about Lord Byron have not had it. That's a good advantage. That's a mark in your column. So the very first thing, if you wanted to write a book on Byron's maiden speech, what's the very first thing you need? A text of the speech. You need to know what he wrote about. He actually stood up and addressed the body to talk about an event of the time. You're going to recognize the name of the event of the time. But you might not recognize the context of it. You're going to need to read up on that context. You're going to need to know exactly what Byron was talking about when he made that speech. You're going to have to do your best to read up on it enough to know also what his hearers would have been hearing. All the nuance in the speech, there's a lot there that if you just read it, bald to the subject not knowing anything, you will miss the things that might have caused reactions in the audience when they heard it for the first time. What's the next step? What were those reactions? You have to find out, you have to verify to the best of your ability whether or not that text that Dallas reprinted is the text that Byron wrote out for his speech. Then you want to find out if Byron actually stuck to his text, right? Because the text doesn't mean anything if he went and ad-libbed. How are you going to find that out? You're going to have to go for primary sources to the memoirs of the men who were in that room. A lot of them will have written letters about it. A lot of them will have included it in their memoirs or in histories of their time or in the history of the subject. Maybe even in reminiscences of Lord Byron. You're going to want to track down as many of those as you can. The men who are in that room are your primary sources for what Byron actually said and what the reactions were in the crowd. They're actually better sources than Dallas reprinting the speech itself. You're going to want to find that out. That's going to require a lot of logistical legwork. You're going to have to find out who was in that room and who was in a position to write a memoir about it or a letter about it or a reminiscence about it, and whether or not they did and where those are. Did Byron ever talk about it, for instance? It'd be another excellent place to start. Did he ever reflect on it 10 years later, 20 years later? Did he ever reflect on his maiden speech? He was, in some ways, a dreamer, and in some ways prone to, had a sweet tooth for figurative language, but he was brutally honest about himself. So if he talked about it, that would be worth knowing. You would certainly need to know that. You need to know every single last little thing that was said about anyone who was directly connected with that speech. And you'd also have to read up on the subject involved, which gives Luddite a whole new meaning. You'd have to read up on the subject involved. In the speech, Byron mentions bloodshed, or things coming right close to bloodshed. What is he talking about? You need to find out what that is. You can't just sail on that. You have to know the subject as well as he did. What provoked the speech? All those are the primary things that you have to do right away. Now, I don't agree with the fetishization that the history community places on discovering new documents. I think they overblow the significance of that. I read once a 600-page biography of Napoleon Bonaparte that's only reason for existence was that the author personally had discovered a cache of like 12 love letters that the pot-bellied little Corsican wrote 20 years before. Had nothing to do with his reign, nothing to do with his rule, nothing to do with his tyranny, nothing to do with his downfall. But it was grist for the mill for a whole biography because the author could say, based on new documents. I've always found that was overblown. Except in our second example. We'll get to the second example in a minute. But nevertheless, is there potential for that here? If you're going to be a true amateur historian, you're going to have the historian's hunger to uncover literally every primary mention of the source, of the subject. Is there a possibility? There's a way to find out, right? Find out who was in that room when that speech was given. The actual roll call, the names of the men who were present. And then simply run down the list. Are there published letters from any of them? Are there letters extant or in a family holding that have not been published? Are there memoirs that maybe one of those men wrote a memoir that has not been published? Do his descendants still have it? Did some of those men write memoirs and mention their reception of that speech, and no one has ever bothered to ransack those memoirs and find out what they said? You just run down a list of the names and find out what those men wrote. And did any of them, can you infer from what you see in their bibliographies that any of them might have written about this speech? This, once upon a time, Byron was extremely well-trod biographical ground. There have been 1,000 biographies of him. But it's possible that no one has bothered to do that. It's possible that you might be the first. Then you want to go from, once you've done that, once you have absolutely, as far as you possibly can, covered the raw material of the primary documents, in other words, the speech itself, the speech giver's reflection on the speech, and everyone else's recollections of it. Those are the primary documents. There are no others. It's not like historians go to some sort of Hogwarts and can mystically conjure real sources out of thin air. Those are the sources. Byron gave the speech. Byron did it from a written text. The written text still exists, or does not. The people in the room heard the speech. They either wrote about it or they did not. What later biographers have written about it is fine, interesting, and we'll get to that, but those are the original documents, and you can find those as well as anybody can. There's no magic to this. So once you've done that, the next thing you do is consult the secondary sources. What have historians said about this? Now, like I said, there have been 1,000 biographies of Byron. Can't really be expected to read 1,000 biographies of Byron. That would be a long time for most people. And most of them are copying from each other and have almost nothing to say about the maiden speech if they have anything to say about it at all. Most of them don't talk about it at all. Or a paragraph, something like that. So you could save yourself a little trouble. If you're a completist, you'll want to track down all of those 1,000 biographies, and you don't need to read them, right? You just need to hunt for their mention of this maiden speech. That's all you need to do, is find out what they say about it, and more importantly, thumb to the back of the book and find out why they're saying what they say. What are they drawing on? I think you'll find, when you do that on this or any other keyhole subject, that 9/10 of those biographers are pulling from the same couple of sources, which are either original sources or are secondary sources. That a lot of them are copying each other. So you can dismiss most of those 1,000 biographies and just concentrate on, let's say, 10. The 10 best Byron biographies. What do they say about it? You're going to want to cover those as well. That's going to be part of the book that you're going to write, is what do later historians say about this? How important do they characterize this speech to be? Do any of them use an interesting turn of phrase that you might want to include in your book? Not steal, but quote in your book. Obviously, since I'm describing this process, I'm leaving out what I'm hoping is obvious, but if it's not, allow me to stress this. You must certainly keep a research journal. Oh my God. You must certainly keep a research journal. Do not think that you are going to remember where anything comes from. You are not. So instead, April 10th, I consulted this book. Here is all of the bibliographical information for this book, the date of its original publication, the author. Here's where I consulted it, this particular library, this particular bookstore, this particular antique dealer. Here's what the author says. Here are the sources from that author. That's a page in your research journal. Don't think that you are going to remember any of that on your own. You aren't. You can save yourself hours of headache by keeping a research journal, so that you know exactly where you're finding everything and when you're finding it and what it is. Will you transcribe it by hand? But you're going to want to know that about those secondary sources. What do they say about this speech? And then the final step is that you want to write your book. Once you have all those materials in place, you have as many materials in place as any historian does. All that's left then is the second part of your job, which is to write it as an interesting story. A boring book is a bad book. So once you've got all your research done, then you have to write it engagingly, which is a thing that 80% of all published historians forget or don't think they ever need to do. So as a result, history gets a reputation that it largely deserves as being a boring reading experience. Well, don't add to that. So you would come up with a title. There are a couple of lines from the speech that would make an excellent title for your book. Your title and also your work in progress should be interesting. a really good working title for a work in progress is interesting, even though no one's going to see it but you, because it thrills you to look at it. It's engaging to look at it. It reminds you that this is fun to sit down and do. So, a phrase from the speech, and then the subtitle, Lord Byron's Maiden Speech. There you go. And that's a book. Now, the obstacles that might come up would be that some of your primary sources would be inaccessible to you. That could happen. And it's possible in a circumstance like that that professional credentials from a professional historian would open doors for them that are closed to you. I would like to think that probably wouldn't be true with a keyhole history. Your librarians can do wonders. All librarians are miracle workers. You don't know what they can find you. And they'll be up for the challenge. Believe me, they, unlike almost anybody else in an official building that you can walk into, they really want to help you. They don't know what it is you want to do, but whatever it is, they really want to help you. So make use of that. But that is, if we're talking about a little, big H history subject, Lord Byron's Maiden Speech. Never read a book on it. Not standing all alone. You could write that book. There's absolutely no reason why you can't. There is no professional certification that means someone can write that and you can't. The proof of this whole thing, the most important part of it, is going to be how interesting a story you make it. Did Byron stumble when he was speaking? Did he stumble literally? He had a club foot? Can you find those details? It's a good subject. It's a good subject for a little book. The subject that he writes about has huge, larger ramifications that come down all the way to our present day. It begs to be put in a larger context. You could do that. There's no reason why you can't. So now that we've done a little capital H subject, let's do a big capital H subject. I'm sorry, this is a long video, but I don't have any video chats today. I don't have any mail today. I don't have any Steve streams today. So why not a longer video on writing history? How interesting. How much fun. Let's do a larger historical subject. We can do it quicker because we've covered the basics already. And it's the same thing. It's the point that I want to stress here, is that it's the same thing. The same principles and the same practices are just scaling up the bigger your subject. They aren't suddenly mystically changing into anything else. In both cases, you must go ad fontes. In both cases, the first thing you do is go to the original sources. Find them, doubt them, question them, sift them, and then you work your way outward in concentric circles. All right, that's my original source. Now, what about the next best thing? If it's a speech, I want the speech and any references to the speech by the speech maker. That's the core of it. Then what about the next rung out? Well, it's the men in the room who heard the speech. Did any of them talk about it at the time? Those are contemporaneous notes. I'll take those. Then later notes. Did any of them reflect on it decades later in their memoirs? A great deal of the men in that room who heard Lord Byron's maiden speech outlived him. I wish that weren't true, but it is. His death might have prompted them to write about him. That's a lot of research. That's a lot of looking around to do. But those practices stay true even if you deal with a bigger subject. It's just you're going to have more to sift through. So let's take a bigger subject. You all know Lord Byron's name. You also know Anne Boleyn's name. England's King Henry VIII was enraptured and aroused by Anne Boleyn, the daughter of a minor courtier. And as a result, he divorced his rightful wife and queen, Catherine of Aragon, and broke with the church in Rome, specifically so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, because he wanted a legitimate male heir and also because he was a horn dog. and she promised him a male heir. That we're fertile stock, the Boleyns, I will give you a male heir. She could not possibly know that that was true, and it turned out it wasn't true. She gave him a daughter, but she miscarried as well of a boy. And once that sort took its toll on her, and once that broke the spell of the ensorcelment, Henry's eyes started to wander to Wolf Hall, to the Seymour family, and away from Anne. And because he was the type of personality that he was, he immediately wanted to violently repudiate what he had done. So he set the machinery in motion to have Anne arrested and tried for treason, for instance, for imagining and speaking about the death of the king, and also for a whole bunch of other things, including infidelity. Famously, Anne Boleyn and a group of men were arrested and put on trial. Now, 4 of those men, Smeaton, Brereton, Weston, and Norris, were tried in one batch. They were all found guilty, and they were all executed. 2 of the other people in this huge, unprecedented legal spectacle were Anne Boleyn and her brother, George, who were tried separately because they were peers of the realm. So they had a different court, they had a different commission, they had basically a different jury on which presided their uncle and their father. And among the many things that they were charged with was incest. And Anne Boleyn said that it never happened. George Boleyn said that he was innocent and loudly vituperated against the advice of the fact that the court was proceeding on the testimony of one woman. That has largely been understood over the centuries to mean his wife. There have been some who stick up for his wife, Jane Boleyn, of all the people to stick up for her. There are some people who've stuck up for her and said that it wasn't her and it's someone else. But either way, of course, their fate was sealed. Anne didn't really believe that. I don't think until the very last minute of her life she really believed that Henry would kill her. I think until the end of her life she was thinking he would reprieve her. But there was never any thought about George Boleyn. He was always going to die, and he did die. Now, what if you wanted to write a larger history about that? Not the downfall of Anne Boleyn, not the final year of Anne Boleyn, not the legal execution of Anne Boleyn, but the trial of Anne Boleyn and her brother. And maybe you want to call it The Trial of Anne Boleyn. That book has never been written. What if you wanted to do that? Well, you see right away, that's a much bigger subject. much, much bigger than Lord Byron's maiden speech that usually gets a paragraph in a biography of him, no matter how long that biography is. Lots of books have been written on the downfall of Anne Boleyn, not specifically on the trial. That could be your angle, the creative grist for your mill. And here, I know I said that historians tend to fetishize new or original documents. Oh my, look at this discovery that I've made. And I often decry that because the proof is still going to be in the writing. And I've read many, many books that were really good on their subject, even when some crucial document had not yet come to light. Now, in some cases, that's not going to be true, right? If you were going to write a 1,000-page biography of Stalin's minister Molotov, you would need the mountain of documents that are sequestered by Soviet authorities, by Russian authorities. You would need that archive. You could write a biography of him without it, but your biography of him without those documents would be instantly invalidated if someone had access to those documents and wrote a biography. That's just the way it is. But plenty of good biographies of Kafka were written before the person who was literally sitting on primary documents about him was forced to cough them up. Plenty of good biographies of him existed before that. So it is still possible to do. So I resist that fetishization, but nevertheless, if you could uncover the trial records of the trial of Anne Boleyn, well, then you could sell your book to any publisher in the world, and it would set you up for life. There, the fetishization is actually worth it. If you were to come up with a way to figure out where those records are, the actual trial records, not the reminiscences of the people who were there, those are valuable, but the actual trial records, the writing of the clerks at the bench right there on the left-hand side of the room, what did they write of the trial? Those records, as far as we know, do not survive. What if they do? What if they do? What if they're buried in the back of some big, old, dusty account book in a sub-basement of the Church of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne Boleyn is buried? What if they're down in some basement somewhere? What if they're at Hever Castle? in some sub-basement that no one has examined yet, or in the National Archives mislabeled. What if the trial records of Anne Boleyn do exist? Well, okay, if you could do that, that would be worthy of fetishization. That would be your book. But let's say you can't do that, because a whole bunch of people have wanted to do that and failed. Let's say you can't do that, and you just want to write a book about that trial, and maybe about Anne and George. In other words, you want to write about that trial, and you also want to analyze their innocence and guilt. You want to write not only about the trial, but about the issues at trial. That's a lot. That's a lot to cover. A lot of books have been written on that subject. Anne has been the subject of many, many biographies, not many of them good, but you'd still need to know about them. And George has been the subject of a few biographies, not nearly as many as I would expect. But I guess that's because he's fairly elusive as far as a documentary past goes, which has led to speculation. Because there was all sorts of talk, in addition to him rogering his sister, that he was also, to use the indelicate term of the day, a sodomite. Now if you search the biographical record, you will get to centuries after Anne Boleyn, when one particular biographer made that claim and tried her best to substantiate it. You have to deal with it. If you're writing about the trial, you have to deal with it. When was the trial? What was the weather like? How long did it take? How can you estimate, how acutely can you reconstitute what actually happened in that trial? Hour by hour. How long did it last? Who spoke? What did they say? How do you know any of that? A lot of it will be in the National Archives. Now, when that turns out to be true, well, then you run into the kind of snobbery that I hate, but it is real. It does exist. There you might be asked, well, this needs to be attached to a legitimate research project, or I'm afraid we can't help you. For what it's worth, I know it's not going to be much of a consolation if you're told that by some archive or other, that I'm sorry, if you're an amateur, you don't have access to these records. That's not going to be much consolation. But the consolation that I want to offer you is that almost all the historians, the actual writing professional historians that I've ever known, and I've known a lot of them, hate it when archives do that. Most of the historians that I've known very much want people to be asking questions. And quite a few of them also sneered at the idea of professional versus amateur. One historian told me that when it comes to history, to the investigation of history, professional and amateur is only a question of how good your agent is. Did he get you a good deal? And not a question of some kind of mysterious qualification or otherwise. Nevertheless, without those qualifications, some archives might turn you away. There are ways around that. Usually there are ways around that. If you're nice, if you're courteous, if you're persistent, if you can attach yourself in some way to something that sounds larger than yourself. A lot of these institutions only need a fig leaf of justification to let you have it, to let you have access to the stuff that they can help you with. And a lot of them don't require that at all. So it's possible that you could do some Tudor research. What was this trial? Why did it take the shape that it did? What was its grounding? You won't, I don't think you'll need to research the trial of Anne Boleyn and her brother long before you realize that it was all bunkum. That it was made out of nothing at all. It was all just false and provably false. The occasions that were the pinpoints of guilt are false. The criminal could not have done the crime. I myself think that that's less applicable to George Boleyn than it is to Anne Boleyn, but Anne Boleyn was certainly innocent of the charges that she was killed for. It won't take you long in researching this before you realize that, but it won't take you much longer after that before you realize that major Tudor historians, have been on opposite sides of that fence and vigorously argued about it. So it is possible to have the opposite opinion. Where does it all come from? What was the mechanism involved? No Queen of England had ever been put on trial before. What was the mechanism involved? Who was involved in it specifically? It'll bring you cheek to jowl with Thomas Cromwell. Unfortunately, prepare yourself. But that will lead you naturally to the fictional reconstructions of that trial, which has happened at least as many times as the historical ones have. What have historical novelists said about that trial? Starting with Ainsworth, the subject of that Zadie Smith novel, The Fraud, half the people that reviewed that book thought that Ainsworth was imaginary, thought that she made him up. You could start with him, and you could move forward. Everyone else who ever wrote fictional reconstructions of the Tudor era has had a whack at this. What do they say? What do they base it on? How do they characterize it? Philippa Gregory, for instance, paints a very convincing picture of George Boleyn as a gay man who could not be gay at the time and knew it and was bitter about that fact. George Boleyn, in his scaffold speech, makes allusion to the fact that he's innocent of what he's being charged of, but he's guilty of something far worse, and he doesn't say what it is. Could it be that? Or was it just a formula that he was repeating? Hilary Mantel, in her Thomas Cromwell novels, doesn't have so much to say on George Boleyn, but on the subject of George Boleyn being a sodomite, she doesn't have that much to say about it, but she does have characters float the viability of a liaison between him and his sister. They wouldn't really have known each other as adults. There wouldn't have been that idea of immediate consanguinity. Maybe they meet after years and years apart. They've never seen each other as grown-ups. They're alluringly different and yet similar. It's stranger things have happened. It could be. I don't think in the Wolf Hall books, I don't think you're supposed to believe that. Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn were intensely religious. They wouldn't, no matter how louche George Boleyn was down by the docks, they wouldn't have committed incest. They knew they were brother and sister. Whether they knew each other or spent their high school years together or not together, I don't think makes a difference, but you might. You have to look at all of that. And then you write your book, The Trial of Anne Boleyn. What a thing. What an amazing thing. But you can see what I'm saying. Regardless of the size of the subject matter, I mean, we could scale this up even bigger, right? You could write a one-volume history of World War II. God help us all. We'll never hear from you again, but you could decide to do that. The point I'm trying to make is that the practices and principles are the same. They just scale up. That's all they do. The only difference, the only practical impediment to scaling up to a bigger subject is that some archives might refuse to help you. And the groundwork preparation of background reading is much bigger. but that's all. It's nothing mystical. It's just that. So you could do the trial of Anne Boleyn. You'll need, in your second chapter, you will need to give a chapter-long précis of her rise, the trouble, and her fall, so that you can then concentrate on the trial. But you're going to have to background your readers, so that's going to take a lot of reading to get that done and to make it interesting. That's a bigger subject. Or you could pick a smaller, capital H subject, the maiden speech of Lord Byron. And you go into the House of Lords. If you've read your Anthony Trollope novels, you know if you go into the House of Lords, you make your maiden speech. Joe Spivey made his just last week. No one understood what he was saying. Same as things on book 2. But still, there are records of that. You can find that. Not just the text of the speech and whether or not the judge got it right when he reprinted it, and not just the memoirs of the men that were there, but maybe a parliamentary record. That's a smaller subject. It's a keyhole subject, but that's a book. Byron is a well-known name. You could make that book. Or if you're not trusting yourself quite that much on the bigger stage, you could go even smaller, where we started this whole contentious discussion, which find some little thing in your immediate environment. Does your town have a society for the prevention of cruelty to animals? If it does, that society probably has its roots in the 19th century. Does it? Who are the people involved? What are they like? You have to do the research. That's part 1. And then part 2 is to write the story in a way that's as engaging as a Joe Hill novel. Those are both incumbent on you as an amateur historian. The research is only one half. The other half is to write the book in a way that will interest anyone. Anyone. Not just someone who's interested in your subject, but anyone. That's why the larger historical subjects tend to be a little bit easier in that regard. Because if you write a book about your grandfather's 2 platoon mates during 1 month in World War II, no one is interested in that. Most of your family isn't interested in that. No one outside your family is going to be interested in that. If you write about Lord Byron, you're going to be tapping into a much broader interest. If you write about Anne Boleyn, you're going to be tapping into a much broader interest. You might be able to offshore some of that there, but it doesn't absolve you of the responsibility of writing it well. And you can do it. Why not? These are the principles and these are the practices, regardless of what your subject is. Now, if you're feeling a little self-conscious and you want to start small, go right ahead. Start small. Like we talked about the other day. Start with a small thing. Maybe your town has a newspaper. Or maybe, better yet, it has a defunct newspaper. And the reason I say better yet is because if it's a defunct newspaper or just a bland social organization like the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, there won't be any hot tempers. There's unlikely to be any possessiveness involved in a subject like that. No partisan ill will either way, so that you won't have to deal with that when you announce that you are investigating this, that you're trying to build a history of it. A subject like that is largely going to be cold, so you won't have to deal with that. And that can be good. Your first time out at bat, they can be good not to be facing that from other people. You could just start small like that. I would argue that the way you do it is going to be the same no matter what the subject is. You need to find the core of original documentation of your subject and then doubt the heck out of it. What is this? Who says so? Who knows that this record was recorded correctly? Who recorded it? Is there any verification of? I need verification of every single claim in this original thing. Can I find that? And if not, why not? And if I can't find any verification, well, then I've got to spend time analyzing the reliability of the record that I have, etc., etc. You have to, no matter what it is, no matter how small your focus is, that's the first thing you have to do. Find your core of documentation that actually documents what your subject is. Later historians don't make that. That's there on the ground by people who don't know they're writing history. You have to find that original core and doubt the heck out of it. How reliable is this? When was this written? The judge who published the text of Byron's speech was of Scottish extraction. Did this give him a motive to gild the lily about Byron, who had Scottish extraction? Did that give him a motive to be, however benignly, false about the record? Same thing applies 1,000-fold over to any record of the trial of Anne Boleyn, since there were no people in England who liked her. So you have to be on your guard against that too. Those kinds of hot tempers you probably won't have to worry as much about if you do a local subject, but you should still be aware of them. How do you know what you're telling me? How do you know what you're putting down on paper? Same thing even applies to photographs. If there's a groundbreaking ceremony, is the photo cropped? Was it cropped for a reason? Is someone cropped out of it? If possible, it would be nice if you could look at the original. And so on and so forth. So anyway, we've gone on for an hour here, so I'm going to stop. I love this subject. I am currently engaged in the subject on a particular topic heading that I do not advocate. But so I think this works as a wonderful substitute for NaNoWriMo. How thrilling to dig in and do this. I love it not only because it's, I know from firsthand experience, it is so invigorating to do this. It's hard work, but it's invigorating work to do this project. And it's not just writing, the 1 millionth epic fantasy novel. You're creating, both the bigger cases that I mentioned, you're creating a book that no one has written before. It's not just that though. It's also the thrill of knowing that you are treading on sacred precincts, that you are Virginia Woolf walking on the grass until you're warned off it by the officious beetle. You're writing something that I would be willing to bet, judging from my emails, most of you thought that you aren't allowed to write. There's no allowed. There's no allowed. The techniques and principles are exactly the same whether you have a degree in history or not. So I say do it. I say have lots of fun, and I'll check back. But anyway, I'm gonna wrap. I could go on forever on this subject. I'm gonna wrap this up. I don't know if there'll be any other videos today. There's no mail. Nobody wanted to talk to me because I smell. And I also have a lot of the aforementioned writing to do before start of business tomorrow, the weekend. I treasure it because no one can nitpick at me because editors are not around. But I also come to curse it because I let that make me a little bit slipshod so that I spend maybe, I don't know, theoretically 8 hours on a Saturday afternoon reading when I should be working. And then I suddenly realize, oh my God, it's Sunday night and it's, the business starts in the morning and everybody's going to be expecting things of me. So I might not make any other videos today, even a Dune video. But we'll pick up where we left off tomorrow. So anyway, I'll sign off for now, and I want to hear about your projects. And if you want a larger capital H history project to work on, and you can't think of one, feel free to ask me. I could come up with one of these every hour of every day until the end of time. So be happy to supply you with ideas. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you.